I'm thrilled to introduce our summit keynote speaker, Mary Schwarz, Managing Partner, Division Leader at ICF Next Government, who is here to help us make sense of that topic that's dominating all of my conversations, as well as my LinkedIn feed and probably everybody else's for the last 6 months, trends in health communication, including the impact on artificial intelligence on our field. So welcome again, and over to Mary.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, that's me. So before I get started, I actually want to note I did not use AI to produce the content for this session or my talking points. I did use it to create all the images. So these are produced using Firefly, and I've included the prompts in each of them. Because one of the things we're going to talk about is the importance of actually not just using AI and using it wisely, but how you actually use it is a skill you have to learn. So it's something to be aware of. So before we go too deep, I did want to give you a little bit about me. I am a marketing technologist by trade. I started out in the nonprofit sector, building websites and digital engagement systems, both out of need, but also because I love technology and I find it incredibly interesting. So I shifted to health about 20 years ago, and I've served on both the advocacy and the agency sides. So I have supported a number of both government agencies on the state, local, and federal. And while that was involved generating awareness, and awareness has always been a key, the bulk of my career really focused on patient engagement and mapping pathways to sustain and improve this engagement. That's where the technology side really comes in, because how do we start to think about automating and consistently engaging with either members, consumers, or patients. So today we're going to talk a lot about bias, and I thought it was only fair to share my own. I am a hardcore optimist. I am genuinely excited about the prospect of what these emerging technologies, specifically what generative AI can do and how they can help us expand reach and impact. Now, I realize that not everyone feels the same way. And I want to make sure that my enthusiasm is balanced. So to help with that, and I realized when I was starting my outlining that when I was going to present today, I have a lot of opinions, I have a lot of thoughts, many of them are informed, I do a ton of reading, but I also realized I had a ton to learn. Things are changing daily, and it's interesting because it's building on years and years of work where now we're starting to see those rapid advances. So I read everything that I could, but more importantly, I spoke with some exceptionally talented and smart people to gain their thoughts and insights. Now, as part of this, I did come to better understand the unease, hesitation, and doubts, let alone outright resistance that many people have. And that's okay, because hopefully we're going to get to a place where we find the medium where we're comfortable and working to move forward. But one important note, when I was going through and figuring out who I should talk with, I was very intentional because I wanted to both build a team that could help me strike the right balance, but also one that would challenge me and inform me. So as you are sitting here and listening and taking in, I encourage you to think about who can you put on your team. And some of these people will be people you work with on a daily basis. They might be your direct colleagues. They may be people you haven't spoken with in 15, 20 years. This is an opportunity to re-engage with the smart people in your life, and also to offer your help, support, and expertise. Because these systems go both ways, and we truly need to collaborate to get the most impact out of them. So now my goal for today is for you to walk away with some sense of how you can use AI and emerging technologies in your work, or more importantly, to change how you work. Not only do advances in AI make personalization at scale, and I see this as the fundamental takeaway, possible, and we're not quite there yet, but we're really close and the time is coming, it'll probably be here before we realize it, they will fundamentally change how we work. So I'm going to talk through what that may look like and walk you through a couple of very practical scenarios that hopefully serve as a spark for how you may apply this in your own work. We do have a good block of time for questions and answers. And for people who are already using, I'm going to challenge you to think about what can you do next? How can you advance this? And how can you share the insights that you're gaining and learning to help others in the community? Now, I think Michael hit on this perfectly. It's okay to be overwhelmed. in the last 2 months alone, there have been over 1 million media mentions of artificial intelligence on broadcast, radio, print, online, and podcast stories. That's insane. No one can consume that much information. So, and in the past week, we've actually gone from the notion of possible to actually in production on a lot of these tools. So for example, 3 recent headlines. Microsoft launches generative AI service for government agencies. So there's an approved tool that government agencies can use. From Ad Age, the top 5 AI marketing activations to know about right now. So this is in practice, it's in the field. And lastly, Salesforce announced last week that it unveiled Marketing GPT and Commerce GPT to personalize every campaign and shopping experience. Having come from the nonprofit sector, we were just as likely to use Salesforce and these tools. So these are available in ways that will take time to figure out the best application, but they're available now, so we're going to start to need them. Oopsie, I am advancing faster than I realized. Now, as I had said, the goal for the session is to have you walk away with at least one section or one step you can take to incorporate AI into your work. To do this, we do need to speak the same language. So I'm going to go through several key terms now, and I actually do have a detailed glossary that we'll make available after the conference that you'll be able to download. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, and natural language processing have been around for years, but they're important because they are the foundational elements for where we're seeing in generative AI. Extended reality is an umbrella expression that includes tools such as augmented reality, mixed, and virtual reality. It's having a bit of a renaissance with recent releases from Meta and Apple, although we're generally still seeing limited adoption, primarily within the gaming community. So it'll be interesting to see in a year's time how much this has changed. We will have Apple's Vision Pro will be available, and we'll see how much that price point actually has an effect on adoption. Now, large language models, which again have been around for several years, are language models that use massive amounts of data, billions of data points, to power generative AI tools such as ChatGPT, Bard, and Copilot. So now we've touched on generative AI a couple of times, and predictive AI is a very similar technology which produces anticipated behaviors instead of content. Now, one piece that differentiates generative and predictive AI is their ability of these models to continuously train themselves and evolve. This is called self-learning, and without the proper controls in place, it can come with its own set of risks. Now, specifically, as these models train and tune themselves, how they produce results can become less and less traceable. So how we actually source down to where the answer was returned. And this can result also in hallucinations or misinformation being returned. So there's an aspect of making sure that you have a degree of validation and reviews every time you're using these. You can't simply trust something because it was returned. Another key factor for these emerging technologies, they don't simply work straight out of the box. And of course, I realize we don't have boxes anymore, but you get what I'm saying. So how you frame what you ask the model to do, both in terms of the question or request and the end format, are key. You have to learn a system to get the most out of them. So this way of thinking is called computational thinking, and it's going to be critical for all of us to master. You don't necessarily need to become efficient in coding. You do need to understand how computers work and how computational inputs need to be structured to get useful information out. There we go. Now that we have the terms down pat, let's talk a little bit about how they work. The idea with this diagram is that you have component parts of communications, data to inform, content to messaging to engage, and images to capture attention and reinforce messaging. We then can use AI-enabled tools to inform, potentially automate, and advance or optimize how we deploy these through traditional tactics or engagement streams. So it should look familiar, and what it's doing is adding a layer of optimization and efficiency in the middle. And while we aren't necessarily seeing new communications tactics, we are seeing rapid advances in how these work and their effectiveness. And again, I haven't talked much about AR, VR, because that's outside of gaming, it's largely limited, but I do think that'll change in the next year. So as you're thinking about how you may use these tools, it's important to think in terms of the tools as a kit instead of individually. Machine learning, natural language processing, and large language models are essentially categories of software. And much like software, they create different tools for different purposes. They have specific uses. So it's thinking, when you're thinking through these tools, it's getting to the idea of what is the right tool at the right time for the challenge that I have in front of me, or the task that I want to complete. Sometimes that's going to be validation, sometimes it's going to be optimization. It can be a little bit, really, as the number of tools out there and the number of models is starting to grow exponentially. So it's being very intentional and staying aware of what's available to you. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times that these advances will change how we work. And I do mean the actual methods, approaches, and processes. But it wouldn't be fair or right if I didn't start with the risks. With the rampant rise of misinformation and the ease with which these messages are being disseminated, only powered increasingly so by AI and generative AI, we not only have to promote healthy behaviors, but actively combat misinformation. Bots and trolls have been with us for years, and it's often a true act of bravery to speak on behalf of public health. You can't underestimate the personal risk that you put out there when you're going out as a spokesperson or when you're promoting messages. We also need to challenge ourselves. How are we building trust? How do we build reliability? And how do we make it easy to invalidate misinformation? How can we connect with audiences on a personal, if not individual level? How do we overcome the adage of garbage in, garbage out, made exponentially worse by AI, where we've graduated from garbage in to toxic sludge out? So from everything I've seen, generative AI is a starting point, where writers, editors, software programmers are still needed, but with a different capacity. So if you don't plan for what that capacity is, then it will be decided for you. So we're at an inflection point. And these tools can make us faster, they can relieve the burden of work, and much as we saw with the introduction of search and social media, or the original Netscape browser, this is an opportunity for us to evolve how we work. So a colleague of mine shared a recent article in the Washington Post that described how a writer lost their job to AI. It was a good article, and part of that person's job did go away. But where I see it is opportunity, not risk. So anticipate that parts of your job, parts of how you work, will go away or will become more efficient. What can you do with that time? AI can't replace relationship building or community engagement. It can't change the interpersonal. It can't replace that. So how do we shift our mindset to create room and space that we've never had before and move beyond the anxiety and the fear? And much to that last slide, how do we connect with audiences on a personal, if not individual level, both using technologies through automating messaging, but also re-engaging in person? So I thought it would be helpful to walk through a couple of different tools or different examples of AI in action. And not all AI is created equal. So as you start to play with it, do think small and think about ways that it can improve the efficiency of your work, things that will remove pain points for you. So in this example, I asked ChatGPT to produce a 100-word plain language summary of the Tobacco Act. And I've included the prompts because, again, that styling of the prompt is going to be very important as you're thinking about how you use these tools. And I have to say, the summary that it returned in about maybe 30 seconds is decent. I've spent a lot of time reading the Tobacco Act. It's a large focus of my work, so I was actually pleasantly surprised with the outcome. With that said, it was 107 words and at a college reading level, so it didn't quite meet the request. Now, what's really interesting with ChatGPT is that it has the ability that translation and adaptation into spoken languages are one of the areas where there's a great deal of strength and a tremendous amount of opportunity. So I took that summary in English and that GPT had created and asked it to translate it into Turkish. What you're seeing is the result. I then had that translation reviewed by a native Turkish speaker who remarked that actually it was a very solid translation. He did ask me if I had used GPT to create it because he knows that I don't speak Turkish, and that it really was a solid, he was impressed with the output. Now, to give you a sense of how this can daisy chain, I then took the Turkish translation and had it translated into Spanish for Puerto Rico. I shared that version with a colleague who is a native Spanish speaker who is from Puerto Rico. Now, she had some minor edits, which you can see in the red, and she did comment that they were largely stylistic. She did recommend that I have someone who is a native speaker and a tobacco policy expert review. Now, this is one of our PhD colleagues, so needless to say, they're not comfortable with anything less than true precision, to ensure that the meeting carried through accurately. Now, going back to my original, if you remember, I asked it to produce in plain language, and we knew that it was at a college reading level. So I had another colleague who is a plain language writer take a pass at it, and modify it. And what you're seeing, so the plain language side of it really missed the mark. It was a good start, but as you can see from the number and volume of recommended edits, it needed a fair amount of revisions. So the key takeaway here is that ChatGPT and generative AI tools can be very helpful, but they don't work as standalone resources or tools. They work as part of our toolkit and need the same degree of validation and reviews. So let's move a little into an example of applying AI in our work. So as you think about real-time engagement, which as a marketing technologist is something I'm fairly focused on and slightly obsessed with, there are a number of tools that you can use to reach and interact with audiences on their terms. So I chose chatbots because they've been around for a while. They've actually been using AI in their structure, and they're a nice stand-in for other media, such as text messaging or email, and even websites. But there's two features related to a good chatbot that I wanted to call out. First, that they match the conversational tone to the user's tone while also respecting the gravity of the subject matter. That's something we think of as being fairly human. And then second, they are nonlinear and flexible in how the user chooses to engage it. So automating this requires a great deal of thought and intent. That thought and intent we've made leaps and bounds strides in with generative AI. So as we start to capture how dynamic content and the systems that support it can be shaped, we need to think about how we structure information to meet those needs. Before I get into the actual workflow, I thought it would be helpful to share, this is again a tool that a colleague of mine created that outlines the different levels of AI that you can use and how it actually can feed into chatbot features. Now, it's critically important to think of this not just from the point of view of, critically the point of view of the cost that comes with this, but also how you're actually going to pick and choose what's relevant for you in your work. So you don't have to use fully automated AI in integrated systems. There may be a lack of control that you have from that, but you can start to pick and choose the features that are available to you. And we're looking at this example primarily so we have a sense of what is possible, but also how you can actually control it. So one thing to keep in mind with this, as you're adding functionality, you are adding capacity, but more importantly, you're adding cost and risk. So now, getting back to that workflow. So what we're looking at is a sample chatbot workflow, and this is when I was saying there's complex thinking that goes into this, even when using AI. And with the diagram that we have, or the flowchart that we have on the left, is actually what ends up producing a very similar interface to the one that we have, hopefully on your right. It's definitely my right. Right and left is optional here. So when we're thinking about these chatbots, and especially if you're working in health, and especially in particular with government health, we have to be very careful about what information it returns. You can't simply let a generative AI loose because misinformation and hallucinations happen, and there's something we need to think for. So when we were approaching this task of how do we take an existing chatbot and modernize it to get at that personalization, get at that responsiveness, we started to look at using what's called Edge AI. So Edge AI is taking a large language model, taking the functionality and the outputs, but actually restricting the content that it's pulling from to a very small slice of content. So you're realizing the benefits of automation while keeping content that is delivered in the bot contained. So it won't return any message that's available to it. It won't create messages from a full data set, but rather from an approved sliver of content. Now it can learn the need to be responsive and the need to mimic the tone from the larger set while restricting the content that it's actually returning to get into that smaller slice. So again, this makes new levels of, and it's very technically complex, so that's kind of the cost side of it, but it gives those advantages of automation and curation. As is true with most tools, there is a cost and there's a benefit, and you have to decide what's going to be worth for your audience and your organization. Now, what I think is most interesting about this, it makes possible a new level of personalization in messaging. So as you go from, say, chat to email, when we send messages, how often, messaging itself, are you including links, activities, are you asking for polls, how are you engaging? Soon you will be able to tailor that down to the individual based on the behavior that they demonstrate and the behaviors that people like them demonstrate. So this notion of personalization within Reach, which allows us to think in terms of smaller and smaller segments that are enriched by audience attributes and characteristics, as well as behavioral and performance data. We're going to be able to deliver experiences that are tailored to the individual, both in terms of what they see, the messages that are pushed to them, when they're pushed to them, and the page flows, so the actual experience of using digital tools.
Hello, everyone.
That is actually that is actually a live chatbot, but we're not going to listen to that today. Now, it's a lot of conceptual thinking, so I actually thought it would be helpful to do a couple of very practical examples. Again, if I said not all AI is created equal, that might be our one takeaway from today. Some are accessible and small to really focus on the efficiency of how we work. And these are actually 3 examples that my teams are using in various forms to help them work more efficiently. We all should do document sharing and tracking. You can actually continue to expand that and consolidate. Workflow management, so thinking about what are the steps that you take every day, what is repeatable, how do we automate those? And grant reviews or RFP reviews are something we all face. So ways to organize those to cut down on the manual work and allow us to truly focus those reviews on evaluations versus summations. Now, one of the most fun parts of the conversations that I had when I was preparing for this session, I talked to probably 10, 15 different people, was to hear about how everyone are using AI in their personal life, and in particular, generative AI. So almost everyone I spoke with, and myself included, are using it as a starting point to help with writing, in particular with things that can be really hard to write. And the best example that I actually heard of, and I've now used it, is writing condolence notes or notes of loss. That's something that takes a lot of heart to do. It's surprising how well generative AI can give you a starting point. Now, as I've been saying, is particularly true with these tools to work, they are a starting point. You still need to read it, edit, revise, and add details that can only come from your relationship with the person you're writing to. So again, it's more of a partner or a collaborator than anything else. So I've talked a lot about opportunity, giving you a couple of examples of what's possible, ways to use it. Again, it wouldn't be fair if we didn't talk risk and mitigation strategies. So I bucketed these into 4 core groups: bias and hallucination, IP and sourcing or intellectual property and content sourcing, privacy and security, and ethical considerations. So we talked a little bit about bias and hallucinations, and while the larger models have more to work with, so may actually produce more tailored results, because they are, you don't necessarily know what you're working with, and you run the risk of amplifying errors and misinformation. So as you're thinking about the tools that you're using, how can you think about, and this includes both the systems and the people, you have to think about what you can do to ensure accuracy. Can you work with a smaller data set? Can you apply it within the different tools and models within your organization? So think about how to limit and how to contain, but most importantly, how to have a validation strategy. One of the colleagues that I was speaking with this is he's a computational biologist who creates diagnostic tools using imaging. And it was fascinating talking with him because he showed me an example of a tool that they're about to launch. And then he showed me an example of that same tool applied to a marshmallow. He said, with a native eye, it doesn't look that different. It was the chemical structure of the two, a visualization of the chemical structure. He said, so it does require a level. It can look on the surface as though it's right. You have to dig and you have to push. And when it comes to IP, or intellectual property, we're in a whole new world. If there ever was a time to read the fine print, now is that time. So a couple of weeks ago, I was encouraged by a client to use an AI tool for image generation. This was one of my teams. And when we were reviewing the terms, we saw that all of the ownership rights were retained by the company that produced the tool. So normally you buy licensing rights, you arrange this, and you can transfer them to clients, as is a typical deliverable. So we were left without a way, to actually do that, to transfer the final product to the client. Now, mind you, all of the liability, including for the accuracy of the images created, fell to us. So needless to say, not using that tool. So it's really important to understand the tools that you're using and how you're applying them. Now, privacy and security, my caution here is that this is both personal and organizational. Your standard organizational procedures for network data security and integrity are more important than ever. Those difficult people in your CIT who are yelling at you to use two-factor authentication and to not bring other computers into your network, you really have to listen to them. Because when you ask generative AI a question, it becomes part of their model. We must be intentional in what and how we ask, because it doesn't necessarily belong to us or stay with us, but it lives on. And lastly, ethical concerns. We're just starting to imagine the potential that these technologies may have, both for good and for bad. And when creating guidelines, your comfort level is critical, both to rein in the overly enthusiastic, such as myself, and to bring along the fearful. But all of these require active management. Guidelines need to be revisited on a regular basis. Infrastructure needs to be tested to ensure that it's effective in a highly dynamic world. And models, so the data models, the LLMs, need an operations and maintenance budget and plan, just as we treat any software. Because the fear that I have that I didn't actually put up here is that we're starting to see a proliferation of these models. I imagine a number of you are students in the room or online. How many of you are creating large language models or versions of it as part of your work? I had one person I met with who had said they're going to be a dime of a dozen by the end of the year. The problem is there's no maintenance of those. So you create a model, you put it on the internet, it then gets sucked into other models, and you've got things that aren't being maintained that are creating and amplifying misinformation. So again, the trustworthiness, the sourcing is key. So now, as I said up front, my hope for this session was for you to walk away with an intent to act. If you're already using AI in your practice, how can you push yourself further? If you're getting started, what are the ways that you can experiment and start incorporating AI into your work? Because not only is it not going away, it's continuing to evolve and advance at a rapid pace, and catching up will become harder and harder. Oh, and if it wasn't also clear, if there's one thing you need to do, build your team. I do want to thank my team. These are the wonderful people who gave me their time to talk this through. They were instrumental in educating, challenging, and bringing this all together. Now, I think we have time for questions. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone willing to go first? Great.
Sorry, just go to the front. Steve and others.
Thank you, Mary. That was excellent. I definitely learned a lot, and it was clear how much thought and research that you put into just putting that together for us, and in a way that was digestible. So first, thank you.
I'm glad.
My question is, it's sort of a naive question, but at the very beginning and then continuing throughout your presentation, you talked about hallucinations, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, and you said because there is the existence of hallucinations, we have to always validate and we have to check. Are there tools to contribute, that tools that can be used to help address or mitigate the bias or the problems with hallucinations? Or is it just that we have to use humans to do it, the way you did by asking multiple colleagues for translations?
So good question. And the tools are advancing. So they're coming around. And interestingly enough, one of the colleagues that I spoke with, so the tool may actually be a valid data set that you can compare against. So imagine that there's a control. Now, those controls aren't necessarily available yet. It's something that we as an organization could talk about producing. What are the controls for health communications best practice, for communicating related to risk, So those are pieces that we need to create to make sure are available and also available to the public so that they're not simply within your group or overly proprietary. So at this point, it's probably a combination of both. I can't imagine not having a human reviewer.
Hi, in the early days of the internet, you had the big companies, Facebook and Google and so on, set up these authentication methods. So the only way into websites was through their gateway. And as a result of that, they gained a lot of traffic, they gained a lot of rich data. And I'm wondering if there are any structural things that the public health community can do that sort of aligns with the essence of getting at the truth. I mean, Wikipedia, for instance, another example, kind of an early LLM, so to speak.
Right.
Are there ways that the public health community can have these sort of structural infrastructure pieces in order to get at that truth? The other piece I was thinking about, the plugins. So those early plugin developers may have an opportunity to, promote their platform and make sure that that's the way into that community.
So yes, and what's interesting, Wikipedia in particular, is a good example of bias. So Wikipedia, majority white male producers and contributors. So within that, there is a point of view that is amplified. And as that goes into general models that are scanning the internet broadly, that type of bias is further pronounced. This idea of having models or data sets that can be used to validate, I see as the primary means of actually checking that. So a disinformation model that you're actually, that is validated, that reflects best practice, that comes from a neutral party with nothing to gain.
Okay.
Hello. I'm Chelsea. I know you said at the beginning you're an optimist. I am too, but I'm much more cynical about this topic. So I appreciate that you talked about the fact that since you're sourcing from things, if there's bias in those sources, it then draws into the AI that's created. My question is kind of, how do you see, my view on this is that you have these things that you say are not ready yet, but they're close to being ready. But you also have, and so you need this, you need the human element as well, and you probably always will. But you have these tech companies that I feel like overpromise and say these things are ready now, and so you have companies or organizations that are adopting them and either removing the human element or they think they're ready. I know there was a news article a couple weeks ago about an eating disorder hotline that fired all their staff and hired a chatbot.
Only to distribute misinformation.
Right. And so I guess what are your thoughts on how that can be kind of mitigated when you have these messengers that are probably overpromising? And my concern with this, which maybe is just me being like, the future is scary, is replacing jobs because they think that it can be done without a human element, or like image generation. In the bias point, you also get, we don't need a diverse photo shoot because we can just do image generation and represent all these people, but they're not real people.
Correct.
So it's those are my concerns. So I'm wondering what you think can, I know that was a lot, but what you think can kind of.
So I'm going to start with the overpromising by companies, which I agree. I have used many platforms, many marketing technology platforms, and they can be difficult to use or they can overpromise the actual end result. So when I think about this, there's a degree of healthy cynicism with what you're being promised. And to really question, it goes back to reading the fine print. What are they offering? What are the assurances? How are these being generated? Who owns what is actually, I think, a key question that I continue to ask. I also think of this that as we're thinking of use cases, what are the steps that we can take where there is a level of comfort? So the chatbot example that I showed uses Edge AI. So we actually we're training on a larger AI tool, but we're restricting the content to our own actual data set. So how do we use these advances, but apply them within constraint? The use case that I want to see more than anything is timing optimization. So that if you're using a text messaging program to promote healthy behaviors, the time that when I receive that message, the time between messages, the next step that's coming with it. Am I someone who responds to links? Do I respond to questions and prompts? So that's tailored to me. The bias risk isn't there as much because, again, you're predicting next steps versus predicting the content that you're driving back. So there are ways to use the advances that don't necessarily set them free and take away the humans.
Sure.
But I do want to caution, our jobs will change.
Yeah.
And we need to be prepared to change with the jobs. To me, it's creating a lot of opportunity to be more strategic, to be more personal, to build relationships, and to have that one-to-one point of view really become something that we can focus on.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a couple of specific questions and then a broader one. So just because you download a ChatGPT on your computer, that does not mean your organization's information is pulled into it, right?
That is correct. ChatGPT ingests the questions that you put into it unless it's actually given access within your network. With that said, I would not install any software on your machines
Right.
without talking to your Office of Information Technologies.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of getting to. And you said you use Edge AI where you introduce data sets. That means what are you introducing into that? Can you talk a little bit
Sure.
more about the specific sets you're putting in?
So, and we actually will have we're working on a blog post. The team that's building that technology so I will get your name and share it with you after, as soon as it's in review now. The idea is that you are using the technologies that kind of these predictive models that come from an LLM, large language model, that make the way that it's putting content together possible. We then tune that on a specific slice of the content so that instead of it's pulling in the behavioral aspects of how should I frame this from a tone point of view, what is the right length of the message, but the actual content is restricted that it'll pull from and generate from. So it's a way to have both the advances in automation but controls from the content.
Okay. And then finally, of course, might be scary, as you were saying, for some of us in this industry. What are some first steps that you suggest us in the field of health comm just start to play around with it or even apply it to work?
Yeah, start to play around with it. My single favorite example of being used was one of the team members that I spoke with uses it to write apologies to his wife for things that he's done wrong, in her tone. So she must be on the internet and published, so it's actually able to pick up an aspect from her. And fortunately, it seems they chuckle about it. So it's really it's that notion of getting comfortable. And if I were to focus on anything, it's the computational thinking. More time you can invest in that, more thinking around how do I use these technologies to my advantage.
Hi, I'm Zainab.
Hi.
I've been thinking a lot about digital health literacy
Mm-hmm.
and how tools like this, how might they increase the digital divide? And how do you think that we can better educate the general public, even when we as public health professionals are trying to learn about it? People are already using it to get health information, so how can we better educate about the risks and opportunities for them?
So, yeah, really great question. And one of the ways that we've actually experimented a bit with is how we actually frame messages. Are we making them engaging enough? Are we making them interesting enough? Often within the public health space, we're restricted to how we're actually framing messages that are going out. Is there a fun aspect that people don't want to eat their vegetables, or some of you love your vegetables? I'm not a big vegetable person. But how do we start to use these tools to also help us question and review ourselves so that they are, there's a degree, while there is bias, it's often when it's looking at, and we actually have a version of GPT that is within our organization. So we have a controlled data set for ourselves that does allow us to go through and revalidate what we're saying and to check it against both cultural nuance but also appeal, so that would it rewrite it in a more fun way.
Thank you.
Not that fun is everything.
Hi, my name
Hi.
is Joy. I was wondering if you could flip back and show some of the images and how, I'm curious if you can help me understand, and I've encountered this, we've been playing with some of the tools, on my team, if you notice, the hands are always a challenge for generative AI, the noses, the faces.
Yes.
And I work in the hearing loss and hearing aid industry, and we do photo shoots. That's one of the fun parts of my job is making sure that we have really high quality information showing hearing aids, because there's not a lot of it, especially stock photos. And so I was playing around with the AI tools, and it was just shocking how bad it is. And so what is it pulling from? I know that often, like when I use the Google version Bard, it's stealing my own content that I've written to produce answers.
Correct.
And so the imagery, I'm like, what is going on here? Can you explain that?
So I'm using, in this example, Adobe Firefly, which is a beta tool. I believe Adobe is pulling from their own proprietary set of images. And yes, it's messy and abstract. I believe the prompt on this was actually an abstraction, though. So wide range of experts working together. There's then stylistic overlays that you can put in. And I think this aligns with the stylistic, but you're absolutely right. The fingers are weird, the faces are slightly off, that it's not ready necessarily to replace humans. They're getting better every day.
Hello, I'm
Hello.
Shelley Spaeth, and I have a couple questions and then just one quick comment. I know, Mike, I'll be really quick on the one question. Ethics, it feels I'm still having this discomfort around the ethical data we're pulling from people who maybe have given us no permission. So that's like, so I'll let you speak to that. Unintentional consequences, which in our work, we do a lot of work around really trying to make sure before we go out with information and images and all kinds of things, are we making sure we're not having these unintentional consequences? And then lastly, like the notes on condolences and things to the wives, like it feels so wrong to me because it's like this connection of people and all the things we do around emotions and relationships. It's so hard to imagine, but I would just love, I just had to say it because it was giving me that again, but
and I'm going to
discomfort.
start with that one because the using it on a personal level to help me find my voice, I view these tools as a collaborative tool. So it's working with me. It can sometimes inspire, and back to your point of, I don't ever take the end product and send it. There's always a degree of review. There's always some editing. There's always that aspect to it. The ChatGPT scans the internet. So the internet is massive. A lot of people have their information on the internet. They don't necessarily realize it. That is a problem. It is actually, from when I've experimented with it, it's fairly careful about keeping people private. So I think there are some controls in place. But with that said, as you think about applying these tools within your own data sets, really being careful for the output and to make sure that the security and the frameworks around it are very contained, and that you understand who owns the end product and those evolving models. Lastly, if this wasn't clear, don't put your health information into a prompt, because that prompt becomes part of, and the metadata around you when you're using the tool, whether it's through a browser or an app, it knows things about you. It marries them with the information you input.
I was actually also going to talk about this, using it for condolences and apologies and things like that, because I think part of the reason we value those so much is because they're really hard to write, and because it takes a lot of effort and time for someone to put one together. And so I worry about the kind of larger societal consequences of shortcutting that. And then we don't have these close personal connections, because what I think was a 2-hour long, you really thinking deeply about what I mean to you, was really 15 minutes after ChatGPT started it for you.
So I totally understand. And I view it again as a way to help me do more, so that I'm able to reach out to more people, to express more intent and interest, to write notes that I would have let slide, or to put more intent in them. But excellent points.
All right, we have one last question from online before we head to the break. So someone in the chat was asking, what are some of the research opportunities you see for using generative AI for producing mass health comm content?
Can you say that one more time?
The question was, what are some of the research opportunities in terms of using kind of generative AI to generate health comm campaigns?
Yeah, absolutely. So, sorry. Sorry. Okay, all good. From a research point of view, I think it goes back to that notion of these validating data sets. Actually, what should they include? What are the structures? How to make them available? How to ensure that they are maintained and adopted? And then actually testing to see if you are able to create a data set that is used for validation purposes, how are the results actually working? And are the end products that are coming out of them meeting the same standard that you're anticipating? I think a lot of work and intent needs to be put in there, and I would love to see energy and research put in that area. Again, I see that as in a tremendous need, something to validate. The validation is essential to the use of these tools. The ability to have unbiased, available public content that is accurate is going to be critical, and understanding how to use those to make sure that we're using generative AI appropriately would be tremendously helpful. So thank you, everyone. This was great. I appreciate your attention.